Silence hung heavy in the mahogany-panelled conference room of Alistair, Reed and Associates, suffocating and absolute. A gold fountain pen glided across the crisp, heavy stock paper, leaving behind a trail of dark blue ink that effectively erased 10 years of marriage. Sylvia Brentwood didn't cry. She didn't argue or beg for her rightful share of the fortune she had helped build. She simply slid the final divorce decree across the polished table, willing to walk away with nothing just to secure her freedom. Across from her, David offered a victorious, pitying smirk, fully believing he had orchestrated the perfect, ruthless victory. Then, his high-powered attorney slowly closed the file, adjusted his silver-rimmed glasses, looked directly at David, and uttered a single, calculated sentence that shattered the room's arrogant quiet and completely rewrote their entire history. The air conditioning in the 42nd floor office overlooking downtown Chicago hummed with a sterile, mechanical efficiency. It was a stark contrast to the stifling humidity of the July morning outside. But for Sylvia Brentwood, the chill felt perfectly appropriate. It mirrored the absolute freezing over of a relationship she had once believed would last a lifetime. She sat motionless in a high-backed leather chair, her posture impeccably straight, her hands resting calmly in her lap. She wore a simple charcoal grey dress, devoid of jewelry save for a plain silver watch. Across the sprawling expanse of the custom-built conference table sat David, her husband of a decade. Soon-to-be ex-husband. He was flanked by Richard Alistair, a senior partner at the firm, and a man widely regarded as the most ruthless divorce attorney in the state of Illinois. David looked entirely in his element. He was dressed in a tailored navy Brioni suit that screamed Wall Street success, his tie perfectly dimpled, his posture relaxed almost to the point of insolence. He periodically checked his Patek Philippe watch, sighing quietly, as if this dissolution of his marriage was merely a tedious morning meeting, keeping him from more important corporate acquisitions. The papers lay between them, like a physical manifestation of a battlefield, after the smoke had cleared. The terms were brutally one-sided. Over the past 6 months, David's legal team had engaged in a campaign of financial shock and awe, designed to grind Sylvia down to a fine dust. They had presented mountains of documents obscuring his true net worth, funneling the profits from their jointly founded logistics software company, Veritas Solutions, into complex holding companies and offshore trusts. Sylvia had initially tried to fight. She had hired her own attorney, a competent but severely outgunned woman named Margaret Hayes, who had warned her that unraveling David's financial web would take years of litigation, hundreds of thousands of dollars, and an emotional toll that might break her. Every time Margaret filed a motion for discovery, Richard Alistair buried her in thousands of pages of redacted corporate jargon. So, a week ago, Sylvia had simply stopped. She instructed Margaret to accept David's initial, insulting offer. A modest lump sum of $200,000, the deed to a small cabin in Wisconsin that had belonged to her parents, and absolute relinquishment of all claims to Veritas Solutions, the sprawling Lake Forest estate, the investment portfolios, and the luxury vehicles. Margaret had been horrified, practically begging Sylvia not to sign away her life's work. But Sylvia was tired. The gaslighting, the late-night disappearances, the discovery of his prolonged affair with a 26-year-old public relations executive. It had hollowed her out. She just wanted the bleeding to stop. She wanted to sleep through the night without the crushing weight of David's psychological warfare pressing against her chest. Just to be absolutely clear for the record, Mrs. Brentwood. Richard Alistair's voice was smooth, cultured, and entirely devoid of warmth. By affixing your signature to page 42, you are acknowledging that you waive any and all future claims to spousal support. You are agreeing to the equitable distribution of assets as outlined in Schedule B, which heavily favors my client, and you are signing a non-disclosure agreement regarding the internal operations of Veritas Solutions. I understand, Sylvia said. Her voice was quiet but steady. It didn't waver. David leaned forward, a patronizing smile playing on his lips. It's for the best, Sylvia. You were never built for the pressure of the corporate world anyway. Take the money. Go up to the cabin. Paint. Do whatever it is you do. It's a clean break. Sylvia didn't look at him. Looking at him felt like staring into the sun, blinding and ultimately damaging. Instead, she picked up the gold pen that Alistair had provided. The metal was cold against her skin. She turned to page 42. She didn't read the dense legal boilerplate. She had already memorized the shape of her own defeat. She placed the tip of the pen on the solid black line beside her printed name. Sylvia Ann Brentwood. With a few fluid motions, she signed her name. The scratching of the nib against the paper seemed impossibly loud in the quiet room. She flipped to the next tab, initialed the waiver of discovery, and finally signed the quitclaim deed, relinquishing her rights to the house they had built together from the ground up. When she was finished, she placed the pen down precisely parallel to the documents. She pushed the thick stack of paper back across the table toward Richard Alistair. "It's done," she said. Margaret Hayes, sitting to Sylvia's left, let out a quiet, defeated breath, packing her briefcase with rigid, angry motions. She felt she had failed her client, unable to protect Sylvia from a predator like David. David beamed. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated triumph. He had successfully excised his wife from his empire without losing a single meaningful piece of it. He had outsmarted her, out-resourced her, and broken her spirit. He buttoned his suit jacket, preparing to stand. "Well, Richard, excellent work as always," David said, his tone jovial, already shifting gears to the rest of his day. "Have the final copies sent over to my assistant. I have a tea time at Medina at noon, and I'd like this officially filed by the time I reach the 9th hole." Richard Alistair did not smile back. The older attorney slowly pulled the documents toward himself. He carefully reviewed Sylvia's signatures, ensuring every I was dotted and every T crossed. He meticulously aligned the edges of the paper, tapping them against the mahogany table. "Sit down, David," Alistair said. The tone wasn't a request. It was an absolute command, carrying the weight of a judge dropping a gavel. David paused, halfway out of his chair, his jovial expression faltering into a mask of confusion. "Excuse me?" "The papers are signed, Richard. We're done here." "I said," Alistair repeated, his voice dropping an octave, "sit down." David slowly lowered himself back into the leather chair, his eyes darting between his attorney and Sylvia. Sylvia remained entirely still, her expression a mask of passive observation. She had expected David to take his victory lap. She had not expected his own bulldog attorney to interrupt it. Richard Alistair opened the top drawer of his desk and withdrew a thick, crimson-colored folder. He placed it squarely in the center of the table, resting his folded hands on top of it. "The dissolution of your marriage is complete, pending the judge's stamp, which is merely a formality at this juncture," Alistair began, his eyes fixed intensely on David. "Sylvia has officially and legally severed all financial and marital ties to you, your estate, and Veritas Solutions." "Yes, exactly. That was the plan, Richard," David snapped, a hint of annoyance creeping into his voice. "Why the theatrics?" "Because, David," Alistair said smoothly, "that severance was the final legal condition required for me to execute my secondary obligations." Margaret Hayes stopped zipping her briefcase. She looked up, her brow furrowed in deep professional curiosity. Sylvia, too, felt a strange flutter in her chest. Alistair opened the crimson folder. Inside were stacks of bank statements, internal corporate memos, and what looked like a federal subpoena. "When you hired this firm to represent you in your divorce," Alistair continued, "you signed a standard retainer agreement. Embedded within that agreement is a clause regarding the disclosure of illegal activities. As an officer of the court, I am bound by attorney-client privilege. However, there is an exception. It is called the crime-fraud exception." The color rapidly drained from David's face. The smugness vanished, replaced by a sudden, sharp panic. "Richard, what the hell are you talking about?" "I'm talking about Aegis Holdings," Alistair said. The name hung in the air like a live grenade. Sylvia blinked. She had never heard the name Aegis Holdings before, but the physical reaction it elicited from David was visceral. He seemed to shrink in his chair, his jaw dropping slightly, a sheen of cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. I don't," David stammered. "Do not insult my intelligence by lying, David," Alistair cut in, his voice as sharp as cut glass. 3 months ago, while performing standard due diligence to Value Veritas Solutions for this divorce proceeding, my forensic accounting team uncovered a series of highly sophisticated, anomalous wire transfers. Millions of dollars of corporate revenue were being routed through shell vendors, bypassing corporate taxation and funneling directly into offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands under the umbrella of Aegis Holdings. Sylvia stared at David. He was embezzling from their own company? "I confronted you about this privately," Alistair continued, speaking to David but ensuring the entire room heard him. "You assured me it was a legally sound tax mitigation strategy orchestrated by your CFO. I took you at your word, though I advised you to halt the transfers immediately. You did not." David's hands began to tremble. "Richard, this is privileged information. You are my lawyer." "I was your lawyer in the matter of your divorce," Alistair corrected him. "But Alistair, Reed and Associates also serves as the corporate counsel for Veritas Solutions. When a CEO is actively embezzling corporate funds and committing federal wire fraud, the firm's duty of loyalty belongs to the corporate entity, not the rogue executive. Furthermore, utilizing this law firm to draft divorce settlements based on fraudulent financial affidavits constitutes an attempt to use legal counsel to further a crime." You set me up," David whispered, his voice cracking. "You set yourself up, David. You let your greed eclipse your judgment," Alistair retorted. He turned his attention to Sylvia. For the first time, his expression softened, revealing a sliver of genuine respect. "Mrs. Brentwood," Alistair said gently, "the reason I allowed you to sign those papers today, the reason I drafted a settlement so severely tilted in David's favor, was not to destroy you. It was to save you." Sylvia frowned, her heart pounding against her ribs. "I don't understand." Margaret Hayes leaned forward, the pieces suddenly clicking together in her legal mind. "The indemnification clause," she breathed out. Alistair nodded at Margaret. "Precisely. By signing that decree today, Sylvia completely surrendered her equity in Veritas Solutions. But more importantly, the document contains an airtight clause that David insisted upon, absolving Sylvia of any and all liability regarding the company's past, present, or future financial liabilities. David wanted to ensure she couldn't sue him later if the company went public. But in doing so, he legally shielded her from what is about to happen." Alistair turned back to David, whose face was now a mask of sheer terror. The Securities and Exchange Commission, along with the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, issued a sealed subpoena to this firm 5 days ago, Alistair revealed. They have been tracking the Aegis Holdings transfers. They were preparing to freeze all marital assets. If Sylvia was still legally bound to you, or held equity in the company, her personal assets, her bank accounts, and her future earnings would have been frozen and potentially seized in the fallout. Sylvia felt the breath catch in her throat. She had been willing to walk away with nothing just for peace. She hadn't realized that staying connected to David would have meant financial ruin and potentially federal criminal charges as an accessory. By signing the papers and severing the marital estate 10 minutes ago, Alistair said, checking his watch, Sylvia is now fully legally decoupled from you. The $200,000 and the cabin are insulated, considered pre-indictment settlements. She is safe. David leapt to his feet, slamming his fists onto the mahogany table. You son of a bitch! You sold me out! I'll have you disbarred! I'll ruin you! You will do no such thing, Alistair said, calmly, unaffected by the outburst. He slid the crimson folder across the table toward David. Inside this folder is my formal withdrawal as your legal counsel, effective immediately. Also inside is a copy of the federal indictment. The authorities are waiting in the lobby downstairs, David. They allowed you to come up here to finalize the divorce because it simplified the asset seizure process for the DOJ. The silence returned to the room, but this time it belonged entirely to Sylvia. To understand the sheer magnitude of the trap that had just snapped shut around David Brentwood, one had to look back to a rainy Tuesday 6 months prior. The marriage hadn't exploded all at once. It had died the way a grand old tree dies, rotting from the inside out, until a strong gust of wind finally topples it. The wind, in Sylvia's case, had been a carelessly left-open laptop on the kitchen island of their sprawling 6-bedroom Lake Forest home. Sylvia had come down for a glass of water at 2 in the morning. The house was dead quiet, save for the rhythmic drumming of rain against the floor-to-ceiling windows. David was supposedly asleep upstairs, having returned late from another emergency board meeting. The glowing screen of the MacBook had caught her eye. She hadn't intended to snoop. For years, she had trusted David implicitly. When they started Veritas Solutions in a cramped, 2-bedroom apartment, she had been the one writing the initial code while David handled the sales and investor pitches. As the company grew into a multi-million-dollar enterprise, David had slowly edged her out of the operational side, convincing her that her talents were better suited to creative oversight and philanthropic endeavors. She had let it happen, believing they were building an empire together. But that night, tapping the spacebar to clear the screensaver, she didn't see an innocent spreadsheet or a sports website. She saw a secure messaging portal. The messages were between David and an encrypted contact listed only as M. Vance, an offshore account manager. The text was blunt. Transfer of $450,000 complete. Routing through Cayman intermediary. Apex Holdings, structure holds. Keep the wife blind. She signs the preliminary tax docs next week. Sylvia had stood there in the dark kitchen, the blue light of the screen illuminating a face that suddenly felt cold and foreign. Keep the wife blind. She didn't wake him up. She didn't scream or throw plates against the wall. Instead, a chilling, absolute clarity washed over her. She pulled out her phone and took clear, high-resolution photographs of the screen, the account numbers, and the message threads. Then, she quietly closed the laptop, went back upstairs, and laid awake, listening to the rhythmic breathing of a stranger. The next morning, Sylvia did not hire a divorce attorney. Instead, she drove 2 hours out of the city to a dingy strip mall in Rockford, Illinois. There, she met with Benjamin Carter, a former IRS auditor turned private forensic investigator. Benjamin was a rumpled man who chain-smoked and smelled faintly of stale coffee and peppermint. but he possessed an intellect that could slice through the most complex financial obfuscations. Sylvia handed him a burner phone containing the photographs. "I need to know what my husband is doing," she had told Benjamin, her voice remarkably steady. "And I need him to not know that I'm looking." For 3 months, while playing the dutiful, oblivious wife, Sylvia lived a double life. She attended corporate galas on David's arm, smiling for the cameras while secretly intercepting mail, photographing his briefcase contents while he showered, and funneling everything to Benjamin. It was Benjamin who unraveled the true depth of David's betrayal. David wasn't just hiding assets in anticipation of a divorce. He was systematically draining Veritas Solutions to fund a secret life. Benjamin uncovered the existence of Aegis Holdings, a shell corporation entirely controlled by David. Furthermore, he discovered that David had purchased a $3 million penthouse in Miami under the shell company's name, where he was heavily funding the lifestyle of Rebecca Hayes, his 26-year-old PR director. "He's preparing to scuttle the ship, Sylvia," Benjamin had warned her during one of their clandestine meetings in a diner booth. "He's artificially inflating the company's valuation for a potential buyout while simultaneously siphoning the cash reserves. When the music stops, the company will collapse, the feds will swoop in, and he'll be sitting on a beach in a non-extradition country. And because your name is still technically on the founding documents as a silent partner, the IRS will come after you for the unpaid corporate taxes." That was the moment Sylvia realized a traditional divorce would destroy her. If she filed, David would drag it out in court, burning through their legitimate assets in legal fees while keeping the stolen millions hidden. Worse, the scrutiny of a high-profile divorce might trigger the federal investigation prematurely, tying her to the sinking ship. She needed to sever herself from David and the company completely, legally, and permanently, before the federal hammer fell. So, Sylvia engineered her own surrender. She began to act withdrawn, depressed, and overwhelmed. She stopped asking questions about the business. When David started picking fights, projecting his own guilt by accusing her of being distant, she didn't fight back. She let him feel dominant. She let him believe she was emotionally breaking. When he finally dropped the word divorce, presenting it as an inevitable tragic necessity because they had grown apart, Sylvia wept on cue. She hired Margaret Hayes, knowing Margaret was a competent but highly ethical lawyer who would play by the book, exactly the kind of lawyer Richard Allister would enjoy bullying. Sylvia explicitly ordered Margaret not to dig too deep, citing emotional exhaustion. David fell for it completely. His arrogance blinded him. He wanted to finalize the divorce quickly to protect his hidden assets, so he ordered Allister to draft the most aggressive, one-sided prenuptial enforcement and settlement possible. He wanted Sylvia cut out entirely, assuming she was too weak to realize what she was losing. What David didn't know was that a month prior, Benjamin Carter had anonymously mailed a tightly bound, meticulously documented dossier of David's offshore wire transfers, complete with account routing numbers and internal memos, directly to the Chicago field office of the FBI and the SEC. Sylvia had essentially lit the fuse on a bomb, then calmly asked David to sign a document that allowed her to step out of the blast radius. She hadn't factored in Richard Allister, however. She had assumed Allister was simply David's well-paid attack dog. She hadn't realized that the federal subpoena had reached Allister's firm days before the signing, or that Allister, protecting his own firm's reputation and legal standing, would use the divorce signing as the exact mechanism to jettison David from the firm's protection. Back in the conference room, the reality of the situation continued to crush David like deep-sea pressure. He looked at Sylvia, his eyes wide and bloodshot. The smug, condescending executive was gone. In his place was a terrified, trapped man. "You knew," David whispered, the accusation hanging weakly in the air. You didn't fight me on the assets. You let me take the company. You let me take all the liability." Sylvia finally met his gaze. The mask of passive resignation she had worn for 6 months dissolved. Her eyes were clear, sharp, and incredibly cold. "I built that company with you, David," she said, her voice echoing slightly in the silent room. "I wrote the foundational code while you slept. I compromised my own career to support yours. You thought because I was quiet, because I chose not to match your cruelty, that I was stupid." She stood up slowly, smoothing the skirt of her charcoal dress. "You wanted everything," Sylvia said softly. "So I let you have it. The company, the accounts, the hidden shell corporations, and the federal indictments that come with them. They are all yours now. A clean break, just like you said." Margaret Hayes, finally understanding the sheer brilliance of what her client had endured, couldn't suppress a small, awestruck smile. "Mr. Brentwood," Richard Allister interrupted, gesturing toward the heavy oak door of the conference room. "I suggest you take the service elevator down to the lobby. The federal marshals are men who appreciate punctuality." David didn't move. He sat paralyzed, staring at the blue ink of Sylvia's signature on the documents, the very ink he thought had secured his absolute victory, which had instead signed his legal death warrant. Sylvia didn't wait to watch him be escorted out. She picked up her small handbag, nodded respectfully to Richard Allister, and walked toward the door. As she pulled the heavy mahogany door open, stepping out into the brightly lit hallway, she felt something she hadn't felt in nearly a decade. She felt light. The descent in the service elevator felt like a plunge into the abyss. David Brentwood stood alone in the stainless steel box, the harsh fluorescent overhead lighting casting deep, hollow shadows across his face. He frantically pulled at his silk tie, suddenly unable to draw enough oxygen into his lungs. His mind raced, desperately searching for a loophole, a legal maneuver, a phone call he could make to halt the impending catastrophe. But Richard Allister had been thorough. By resigning as counsel and citing the crime-fraud exception, he had effectively radioactive tagged David. No reputable defense attorney in Chicago would touch him until the dust settled, and by then the government would have frozen every liquid asset he possessed. The elevator bell chimed, a cheerful, high-pitched ding that mocked the sheer gravity of his situation. The doors slid open to the loading dock of the skyscraper. Standing amidst the idling delivery trucks and stacks of cardboard recycling were 3 men and 1 woman, all wearing windbreakers with bold yellow lettering, FBI. Special Agent Harrison Miller stepped forward. He was a broad-shouldered man with a weathered face that suggested he had seen every variation of corporate greed the city had to offer. He held a thick manila envelope in one hand and a pair of heavy steel handcuffs in the other. "David Brentwood?" Agent Miller asked, though it wasn't really a question. "Listen, there's been a massive misunderstanding," David started, deploying the persuasive, authoritative tone he used in boardrooms to force acquisitions. "I am the CEO of Veritas Solutions. If you just let me make one call to my CFO, we can clear this entire tax anomaly up before the market closes." Agent Miller didn't even blink. "David Brentwood, you are under arrest for federal wire fraud, tax evasion, and violations of the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. You have the right to remain silent." As the Miranda warning echoed off the concrete walls of the loading dock, David felt his wrists being wrenched behind his back. The cold, unforgiving bite of the metal bracelet snapping shut was a physical shock. He, a man who had dined with governors and manipulated markets, was being frog-marched past a bewildered garbage disposal crew. 4 hours later, David sat in a windowless interrogation room at the Dirksen Federal Building. The bravado had completely evaporated, replaced by a desperate feral need to survive. When Agent Miller finally entered, dropping a 4-inch thick binder onto the metal table, David immediately went on the offensive. "You want the truth? You want the mastermind?" David hissed, leaning over the table as far as his chained wrists would allow. "Look at my wife, Sylvia. She's the one who set up the accounts. She's the tech genius. She wrote the original code. I was just the face of the company. She manipulated the ledgers to frame me so she could steal the company in the divorce." Agent Miller slowly sat down, opening the binder. He pulled out a glossy, high-resolution photograph and slid it across the table. It was a picture of a 26-year-old woman with long blonde hair, sunbathing on the terrace of a luxurious Miami high-rise. "That's Rebecca Stanton, your Director of Public Relations," Agent Miller said flatly. "At 10 a.m. Eastern Time this morning, while you were signing your divorce papers, federal marshals raided that penthouse. It was purchased by Aegis Holdings. Inside, they found a safe containing $2 million in bearer bonds, 3 Rolexes, and a ledger written in your handwriting detailing kickbacks from offshore vendors." David stared at the photograph, the color draining from his face. "Now," Miller continued, pulling out a second document. "Let's talk about your ex-wife. Sylvia Brentwood voluntarily submitted herself to a proffer session with the U.S. Attorney's Office 3 days ago. She handed over undeniable cryptographic proof that she has been locked out of the company's financial servers for over 3 years by your explicit administrative orders. Furthermore," Miller flipped to a specific page, a copy of the divorce decree signed just hours ago. "She provided us with this, a legally binding indemnification clause drafted by your own lawyers at your strict insistence, legally declaring that she had zero knowledge of or involvement in the financial operations of Veritas Solutions. You built a legal fortress to keep her from getting your money, Mr. Brentwood. You didn't realize you were actually building her an impenetrable shield against federal prosecution." David slumped back in the metal chair, his breathing shallow. The absolute perfection of the trap Sylvia had built was finally clear. She hadn't just beaten him. She had used his own supreme arrogance, his own greed, and his own ruthless attorneys to dig his grave, throw him in, and bury him under the full weight of the United States government. 400 miles north, the air was crisp and smelled of pine needles and damp earth. Sylvia stood on the wooden deck of her parents' old cabin in Door County, Wisconsin. She wore a thick, knitted sweater, holding a mug of black coffee, watching the gray waters of Lake Michigan lap against the rocky shoreline. Her phone, sitting on the small patio table, had been vibrating incessantly for 2 days. The financial news networks were having a field day. Veritas CEO arrested in massive embezzlement sweep. Chicago tech darling collapses amidst scandal. The stock of the company she had birthed in a cramped apartment had plummeted to pennies on the dollar before trading was officially halted. The SEC had appointed a federal receiver to liquidate the company's assets to pay back the defrauded investors and the IRS. The sprawling Lake Forest estate, the luxury cars, the Miami penthouse, all of it was seized. David was currently sitting in the Metropolitan Correctional Center, having been denied bail as a flight risk due to the offshore accounts. Sylvia took a slow sip of her coffee. She felt a profound, quiet grief. But it wasn't for David. It was for the decade of her life she had poured into an illusion. But beneath the grief, the bedrock of her newfound freedom was solid and unshakable. The crunch of tires on the gravel driveway broke her reverie. An older, unassuming grey sedan parked near the woodshed. Benjamin Carter stepped out, lighting a cigarette before he even closed the car door. He wore his usual rumpled trench coat, looking entirely out of place in the serene wilderness. Sylvia walked down the wooden steps to meet him. "Benjamin, I didn't expect you to make the drive all the way up here." "I prefer doing the final debrief in person," Benjamin said, taking a long drag of his cigarette. "Plus, I had to drop off the hard drives. The FBI made their copies. These are your originals." He handed her a heavy, padded manila envelope. "Thank you. For everything," Sylvia said sincerely. "Have you sent me your final invoice?" Benjamin waved a dismissive hand. "Already paid in full from the retainer you gave me. You're a free woman, Sylvia. The SEC receiver completely cleared you. They looked at the divorce settlement, looked at David's indemnification clause, and decided you were just another victim of his fraud. They aren't coming after the 200 grand or this cabin." "Good," she said softly. Benjamin leaned against the hood of his car, narrowing his eyes at her. Despite his rumpled exterior, nothing escaped his notice. "You know, Sylvia, there's one thing that's been bothering me about this whole operation." Sylvia raised an eyebrow. "Oh?" "Yeah," Benjamin said, crossing his arms. "I went back through the original founding documents for Veritas Solutions, the ones from 10 years ago. David thought he owned the whole pie, and he certainly controlled the voting shares. But I noticed something about the core algorithm, the predictive logistics code that actually makes the software work, the thing all the clients are actually paying for." Sylvia's expression remained perfectly neutral, though a faint, almost imperceptible spark ignited in her eyes. "The patent for that core architecture," Benjamin continued, his voice dropping slightly, "isn't owned by Veritas Solutions. It's licensed to them. It's owned by a little LLC called Oakhaven Technologies, an LLC registered in Delaware, entirely in your maiden name, established 3 months before you married David." The wind rustled through the pine trees, filling the silence between them. "David was an aggressive salesman," Sylvia said, her voice smooth and measured. "But he never respected the actual engineering. He assumed that because I was his wife, what was mine was his. He never bothered to read the fine print of the original licensing agreement I drafted. It stipulated that the license was non-transferable and would immediately terminate upon the bankruptcy or dissolution of Veritas Solutions." Benjamin let out a low, impressed whistle. He flicked his cigarette ash onto the gravel. "So, let me get this straight. The feds just seized Veritas Solutions to sell off its assets, but the company doesn't actually own the code that makes it valuable. They seized an empty shell, a brand name and some office furniture." "Correct," Sylvia said. "And the actual technology, the code worth hundreds of millions of dollars, reverts entirely back to you." Sylvia took another sip of her coffee. "It never left me, Benjamin. I just let David lease it while he built the infrastructure." Benjamin shook his head, a genuine smile breaking through his usually cynical demeanor. "You didn't just escape the blast radius, Sylvia. You let him detonate his own company so you could sweep up the rubble and keep the diamond inside." "He wanted me to walk away with nothing," Sylvia replied, looking out over the vast, turbulent waters of the lake. "I merely obliged him. What happens to the intellectual property of Oakhaven Technologies is entirely outside the purview of the marital estate he so desperately wanted to protect." Just then, Sylvia's phone buzzed again. She glanced at the screen. It was an incoming call from Nathaniel Reed, the other senior partner at Alistair, Reed and Associates, the firm representing the federal receivership tasked with liquidating Veritas. She knew exactly why he was calling. They had just discovered the licensing anomaly. They realized they had a multi-million-dollar tech company with no actual technology to sell. They needed her. Sylvia didn't answer it. She let it ring, echoing across the quiet deck, savoring the absolute power of knowing that, for the first time in a decade, she was the one holding all the cards. The mahogany-paneled conference room of Alistair, Reed and Associates looked exactly the same as it had 2 weeks prior, yet the atmospheric pressure inside had fundamentally inverted. Sylvia Brentwood sat in the exact same, high-backed leather chair, wearing a tailored cream-colored suit that radiated quiet authority. To her left sat Margaret Hayes. Margaret no longer looked defeated or anxious. She sat with her spine perfectly straight, a thick, impeccably organized binder resting before her like a loaded weapon. Across the sprawling table sat a tribunal of desperate men. Richard Alistair, the once arrogant bulldog, looked visibly aged, his silver-rimmed glasses resting on a face carved with exhaustion. Beside him sat his senior partner, Nathaniel Reed, a man whose usual polished veneer was cracking under the immense strain of a federal catastrophe. Flanking them both was Thomas Kensington, the federal receiver appointed by the SEC to liquidate Veritas Solutions and recover the stolen millions. Mrs. Brentwood, Kensington began, clearing his throat. The federal receiver was a man unaccustomed to begging, but the subtle tremor in his hands betrayed his position. We appreciate you coming down from Wisconsin. As you are no doubt aware, the receivership is in the process of auditing the remaining viable assets of Veritas Solutions to compensate the defrauded investors. I am aware of what the news has reported, Mr. Kensington, Sylvia replied, her voice cool and perfectly level. Kensington exchanged a nervous glance with Nathaniel Reed. Yes. Well, in the course of valuing the company's proprietary software, we encountered a discrepancy regarding the core logistical algorithm. The patent traces back to an LLC called Oakhaven Technologies. It is not a discrepancy, Margaret Hayes interjected sharply, opening her binder. It is a foundational legal fact. Oakhaven Technologies holds the exclusive patent for the algorithm. Veritas Solutions operated solely under a conditional, non-transferable software license. Nathaniel Reed leaned forward, attempting to project the formidable intimidation his firm was famous for. Be reasonable, Sylvia. Oakhaven was formed mere months before your marriage to David. The courts could easily view this as a marital asset, constructively folded into the operations of Veritas. You operated as a single economic unit for 10 years. If we litigate this, the SEC can freeze Oakhaven just as easily as they froze Veritas. Sylvia didn't flinch. She turned her gaze to Richard Alistair, who had remained conspicuously silent. Richard, Sylvia said softly, would you like to explain to your partner why that is a remarkably hollow threat? Alistair slowly removed his glasses, pinching the bridge of his nose. He looked at Reed with grim resignation. She is immune, Nathaniel. We made sure of it. What are you talking about? Reed demanded. Alistair pointed a heavy finger at the center of the table. 2 weeks ago, in this very room, at the explicit, aggressive direction of our former client, David Brentwood, I drafted a master settlement agreement. Clause 4, subsection B, stipulates that David acknowledges Sylvia's premarital assets, specifically listing Oakhaven Technologies by name, are strictly her sole property, entirely detached from the marital estate. Alistair turned his tired eyes to the federal receiver. Furthermore, the indemnification clause David forced her to sign legally severs her from any operational, financial, or civil liability regarding Veritas. If you try to sue her for the IP, Mr. Kensington, you will be met with a federal judge waiving the very divorce decree this firm filed to protect David's hidden money. It is an ironclad firewall. We built it ourselves. A heavy, suffocating silence descended upon the men. They had seized a golden goose, only to discover the egg-laying machinery belonged to the woman they had just legally emancipated from all collateral damage. "So," Kensington said, his voice barely above a whisper, "Veritas Solutions is essentially worthless. We have millions of dollars in outstanding corporate debt, massive tax liabilities, and angry shareholders, and the only thing we actually own is the office furniture and the server hardware." "And the client list," Sylvia pointed out calmly. "Though, without the software to service those clients, they will inevitably breach contract and leave within the month." Nathaniel Reed dragged a hand over his face. "What do you want, Sylvia? You didn't come here just to gloat. You know we are staring down the barrel of a federal liquidation. Name your price for the Oak Haven license. We can structure a buyout." "I am not selling the license," Sylvia interrupted. Panic flashed across Kensington's face. "Mrs. Brentwood, if you revoke the license, Veritas collapses entirely tomorrow. Thousands of jobs, the remaining investor capital. It all goes up in smoke." "I am aware," Sylvia said. She leaned forward, resting her forearms on the mahogany table. "Which is why I am not here to sell. I am here to buy." Margaret Hayes slid a single, crisp document across the table. It came to rest directly in front of Thomas Kensington. "Oak Haven Technologies is prepared to offer the federal receivership a sum of $6 million, Margaret stated, her tone strictly business. "In exchange, Oak Haven will acquire the physical infrastructure, the server farms, the trademark, and the complete client directory of Veritas Solutions. We will assume none of the corporate debt, none of the tax liabilities, and none of the criminal penalties incurred by David Brentwood." Kensington stared at the number. $6 million? The company was valued at $200 million 3 months ago. "That valuation was based on a lie fabricated by a felon," Sylvia retorted, her voice suddenly cracking like a whip. "The company you currently hold is bleeding cash by the hour. Without my algorithm, it is a corpse. $6 million gives the receivership an immediate injection of clean liquidity to pay off the IRS and begin restitutions. It allows the innocent employees to keep their jobs under new management. And it allows you to close this catastrophic file." Kensington looked at Alistair and Reed. The two high-priced lawyers looked thoroughly defeated. They were cornered. Sylvia had systematically engineered a scenario where the only way to salvage anything from the wreckage of David's criminal empire was to hand the entire kingdom back to her, legally scrubbed clean of his toxic debt. "You planned this," Nathaniel Reed breathed out, staring at Sylvia as if seeing a ghost. "You knew he was stealing. You let him file for divorce. You let us draft the most aggressive severance possible, knowing it would act as a shield against the SEC. You used us to amputate the diseased limb so you could walk away with the healthy body." Sylvia stood up, buttoning her suit jacket. "David spent 10 years underestimating my intelligence because I preferred to write code in the quiet rather than shout in the boardroom. He believed my silence was weakness. I simply allowed him to continue believing it until it was no longer convenient." She looked down at the men one last time. "You have 24 hours to accept the Oak Haven buyout. After that, I withdraw the offer. The software license officially terminates, and Veritas Solutions ceases to exist. Good day, gentlemen." The Dirksen Federal Courthouse in downtown Chicago was a towering monolith of black glass and steel, an architectural embodiment of the unyielding justice system. 14 months had passed since the ink dried on the divorce papers in Richard Alistair's mahogany-paneled office. Outside the courthouse, the plaza buzzed with a chaotic swarm of journalists from CNBC, Bloomberg, and local affiliates, all clamoring for a final soundbite on the spectacular, highly publicized implosion of Veritas Solutions. Inside courtroom 1419, however, the atmosphere was suffocatingly still. Sylvia Brentwood sat in the back row of the gallery, an island of calm amidst the tension. She wore a perfectly tailored charcoal trench coat, a subtle echo of the dress she had worn on the day she signed her life away, or rather, the day she bought it back. She did not fidget. She simply waited for the final accounting. The heavy wooden side doors opened, and the bailiff led David Brentwood into the courtroom. The collective intake of breath from the gallery was audible. David was a ghost of the man who had once graced the covers of tech and business magazines. Stripped of his custom-tailored navy Brioni suits and Patek Philippe watches, he was swallowed by the oversized, bright orange jumpsuit of the Metropolitan Correctional Center. His posture, once rigid with arrogant authority, was now utterly collapsed. Because Oak Haven Technologies had legally absorbed the operational assets of his former empire, David had been left entirely destitute. With his offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands frozen by international authorities and his young accomplice turned state's witness for full immunity, he hadn't even been able to afford private counsel. He sat heavily beside a visibly exhausted federal public defender named Thomas Kessler. Assistant United States Attorney Robert Callahan approached the podium to deliver the government's final sentencing recommendation. Callahan was a methodical, unsmiling man who laid out the wreckage of David's hubris with surgical precision. He detailed the intricate web of shell companies, the blatant corporate tax evasion, and the millions of dollars funneled away from honest investors to fund a secret, lavish lifestyle in Miami. "Your Honor," Callahan stated, his voice ringing through the cavernous room, the defendant did not merely break the law. He manipulated the very institutions designed to protect people. He attempted to use the family court system and a fraudulent divorce settlement to insulate his stolen wealth, leaving his former wife as the intended collateral damage for a massive federal indictment. Judge Meredith Wallace, a jurist renowned in the Northern District of Illinois for her zero-tolerance policy on white-collar crime, peered down at David over her reading glasses. She offered him the customary opportunity to address the court before sentencing. David stood up, his hands trembling as he gripped the edge of the defense table. He looked desperate, his eyes darting frantically around the room. "Your Honor," David began, his voice raspy and devoid of its former boardroom resonance. "I made mistakes. I admit that. But I was under immense pressure. The market expectations, and my wife, Sylvia. She handled the back-end architecture. If she had just—" Judge Wallace struck her gavel, the sharp crack silencing him instantly. "Mr. Brentwood, you will not use this platform to further defame a woman who has been entirely exonerated by the Securities and Exchange Commission, the FBI, and this very court," the judge reprimanded, her tone like ice. "Your profound inability to accept responsibility is staggering." The judge leaned forward, clasping her hands. "Your actions demonstrate a pathological level of greed and a complete disregard for the fiduciary duties you owed to your investors, your employees, and the law itself. It is the judgment of this court that you be remanded to the custody of the Federal Bureau of Prisons for a term of 180 months. 15 years. No possibility of parole for federal charges. You are further ordered to pay full restitution in the amount of $42 million, she concluded. Absolute financial ruin. As the U.S. Marshals moved in to apply the heavy steel transport cuffs to his wrists, David turned his head. His sunken eyes scanned the packed gallery, passing over the angry, defrauded shareholders and eager reporters until they locked dead onto Sylvia in the back row. The air between them seemed to crystallize, suspended with the weight of a decade of shared history, the early struggles in a cramped apartment, the late nights building code, the gradual betrayals, and the final, catastrophic deception. David's eyes pleaded for a flicker of recognition, a shred of pity, or even anger. He desperately wanted something to prove he still mattered to her, that his downfall had at least caused a ripple in her emotional waters. Sylvia gave him nothing. She did not smile. She did not gloat. She simply offered him a gaze of absolute, chilling indifference. He was no longer a threat. He was a closed chapter. He was a bug in her system that had finally been isolated and permanently deleted. She stood up smoothly and walked out of the courtroom before the marshals even led him through the side doors. Stepping out onto the concrete steps of the plaza, the crisp autumn wind caught the lapels of her coat. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a secure email from Margaret Hayes, now proudly serving as the chief legal officer for the newly minted Oakhaven systems. The message contained the finalized corporate contracts. Under Sylvia's sole, undisputed leadership, the legally scrubbed company had just secured a massive 10-year logistics contract with the federal government, the very entity that had dismantled her ex-husband. Sylvia looked up at the towering steel and glass skyscrapers of the Chicago skyline. For years, she had allowed David to dictate her place in that world, relegating herself to the shadows while he stood in the spotlight of an empire built entirely on her genius. But the shadows had proven to be the perfect place to build an inescapable trap. She hailed a black town car, giving the driver the address to the newly renovated Oakhaven headquarters in the Loop. It was time to get back to work. The destruction of David Brentwood serves as a stark reminder that the loudest voice in the room is rarely the most dangerous. For a decade, Sylvia Brentwood's silence was misinterpreted as submission, her compliance mistaken for ignorance. Yet, in the ruthless arena of power and betrayal, she proved that true strategy does not require theatrics. It requires patience, precision, and an unshakable nerve. By weaponizing her husband's own towering arrogance and legal aggression, she engineered a masterclass in survival, stepping flawlessly out of the blast radius of his collapsing empire. Her story redefines the concept of victory. She did not lower herself to fight for the scraps of a broken marriage. She rewrote the rules of the entire game. Ultimately, she demonstrated that sometimes the most profound strength lies not in the refusal to sign the papers, but in knowing exactly what you are signing away.